The year is 1241. For nearly 2 decades, the Mongol horde has been an unstoppable force of nature, sweeping across the known world like a dark tide. They have shattered armies 10 times their size, burned cities that stood for centuries, and brought empires to their knees. Now they stand at the very gates of Europe itself. But on a spring day near the city of Lignitz in Silesia, something unprecedented is about to happen. A battle that will determine whether the heart of Christendom falls to the greatest cavalry force the world has ever seen, or whether Europe will find a way to survive its darkest hour. This is the story of how one desperate stand changed the course of history forever. To understand the magnitude of what occurred at Lignitz, we must first journey back to the steppes of Mongolia, to a time when a brilliant and ruthless leader united the nomadic tribes under one banner. Genghis Khan had transformed disparate warrior clans into the most sophisticated military machine of the medieval age. But this wasn't just an army, it was a system, perfected over generations of constant warfare. Every Mongol warrior was trained from childhood to ride, shoot, and kill with terrifying efficiency. Their composite bows could pierce armor at 200 yards. Their horses were bred for endurance, capable of traveling 100 miles in a single day. And their tactics, refined through countless campaigns across Asia, were decades ahead of anything Europe had seen. By the time Genghis Khan's grandson, Batu Khan, turned his attention westward in the late 1230s, the Mongols had already conquered the largest land empire in human history. They had obliterated the Khwarezmian Empire, crushed the armies of the Jin dynasty, and brought the proud warriors of Russia to their knees. The Russian princes, who had foolishly underestimated these strange horsemen from the east, learned their lesson in blood at the Battle of the Kalka River in 1223. There, a massive coalition of Russian and Cuman forces was utterly annihilated. The Mongols demonstrated tactics that seemed like sorcery to medieval European minds. Feigned retreats that lured enemies into devastating ambushes. Coordinated movements across vast distances with messenger systems that put European communication to shame. Psychological warfare that broke armies before the first arrow was loosed. But the invasion of 1223 was merely a reconnaissance in force, a probing attack to test the strength of these Western kingdoms. The Mongols withdrew, seemingly satisfied with the terror they had sown. For nearly 2 decades, Europe remained largely ignorant of the storm gathering in the east. Then, in the winter of 1237, that storm broke with apocalyptic fury. Batu Khan, commanding perhaps 150,000 of the finest cavalry warriors ever assembled, launched a full-scale invasion of Eastern Europe. The timing was calculated with characteristic Mongol precision. Winter, when European armies typically disbanded and roads became impassable, was when the Mongols were at their strongest. Frozen rivers became highways for their horses. The harsh conditions that would cripple European forces were mere inconveniences to warriors raised in the brutal climate of the Mongolian steppes. The Russian principalities fell one by one like dominoes. Ryazan was besieged and burned. Vladimir Suzdal, the most powerful Russian state, saw its cities reduced to ash and its population slaughtered or enslaved. The Mongols moved with terrifying speed and coordination, their armies splitting and reforming like mercury, communicating across hundreds of miles through an elaborate system of messengers and smoke signals. Cities that resisted were made examples of with such savage brutality that others often surrendered without a fight. Those that capitulated were sometimes spared, but resistance meant total annihilation. Every man, woman, and child put to the sword. Every building burned to the ground. It was a calculated strategy of terror designed to break the will of their enemies before battle was even joined. By 1240, the Mongols stood at the borders of Poland and Hungary. King Bela IV of Hungary received desperate letters from terrified Russian princes, warning him of the approaching doom. But like so many before him, Bila underestimated the threat. How could a horde of primitive horsemen from the distant steppes possibly threaten the flower of European chivalry? Europe's military might was built on the armored knight, the heavy cavalry that had dominated battlefields for centuries. These warriors, encased in metal from head to toe, riding massive war horses bred for power rather than speed, were the tanks of the medieval age. Surely, European military superiority would prevail. This fatal arrogance would cost Europe dearly. In early 1241, the Mongol army split into several columns, a maneuver that demonstrated both their confidence and their strategic sophistication. The main force under Batu Khan and the brilliant General Subutai drove into Hungary, but a northern force, commanded by Princes Kadan and Baidar, swept into Poland. Their objective was twofold. First, to prevent Polish forces from reinforcing the Hungarians. Second, to test the mettle of the Western European armies and spread terror that would paralyze resistance. The northern column moved with characteristic Mongol speed, covering distances that seemed impossible to medieval observers. They bypassed fortified cities, striking instead at the agricultural heartland, burning crops, massacring villagers, and creating a wave of refugees that would clog roads and spread panic faster than any army could march. The Polish kingdom, fractured by internal divisions between various dukes and princes, struggled to mount a coordinated defense. Duke Henry II of Silesia, known as Henry the Pious, was a young man of remarkable courage and determination. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Henry took the Mongol threat seriously. He immediately began gathering forces for a decisive confrontation. But assembling a medieval army was no simple task. Knights had to be summoned from their estates. Town militias needed to be mustered, supplies gathered, messages sent to potential allies. All of this took time, and time was the one resource the Poles lacked. The Mongols were coming, moving faster than any European army could match. Henry sent urgent pleas for assistance throughout the region. His most important ally would be King Wenceslaus I of Bohemia, who commanded a substantial army. If Henry could unite his forces with the Bohemian army, they would have a fighting chance. But Wenceslaus was still several days' march away, and the Mongols were closing in rapidly. Henry faced an agonizing decision. Should he wait for reinforcements and risk the Mongols ravaging his lands unopposed? Or should he march out to meet them with whatever forces he could gather, risking everything on a single battle? It was a choice that would haunt him. For Henry the Pious was not just a duke. He was a deeply religious man who saw himself as a defender of Christendom itself. The very name he bore, Henry the Pious, reflected his devotion to the church and his people. On April 9, 1241, Henry made his decision. He would march out to meet the Mongol horde at a place called Legnicki Pole, known to history as the Battle of Liegnitz, or Legnica. His army, though substantial by European standards, was a patchwork force that reflected the complex military and political. At its core were Henry's own knights from Silesia, heavily armored cavalry who represented the elite of Polish military power. These were professional warriors, trained from boyhood in the arts of war, fighting from horseback with lance and sword. Their armor, constantly evolving to counter new threats, consisted of mail reinforced with plates of steel. They rode powerful destriers, war horses that cost as much as a small village, and were trained specifically for the brutal shock of cavalry combat. Supporting the Polish knights were contingents from the military orders that had become so prominent in the defense of Christian Europe. The Knights Templar, that legendary order of warrior monks, sent a force to Henry's aid. These were among the most formidable fighters in all of Christendom, men who had taken monastic vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but who fought with a ferocity born of absolute faith. The Hospitallers, Another military order originally founded to provide medical care for pilgrims, but now equally devoted to holy war, also contributed forces. Most significantly, Henry's army included a substantial contingent from the Teutonic Knights, the German military order that had been fighting pagans and expanding Christian influence in Eastern Europe for decades. But the army that gathered at Lignitz was not composed solely of professional warriors. Medieval armies were complex affairs, and Henry's force included thousands of less well-equipped soldiers. There were town militias from Silesian cities, men who were craftsmen and merchants in peacetime, but who were required to bear arms in defense of their homes. These men wore whatever armor they could afford, often just padded jackets called gambesons and simple helmets. They fought with spears, axes, and whatever weapons came to hand. There were also contingents of miners from the Silesian silver mines, tough men used to hard labor and danger. Some carried crossbows, weapons that were slower to reload than traditional bows, but which could punch through armor with devastating effect. And there were others, poorly armed peasants pressed into service, men who had never held a weapon before, but who were expected to stand and fight against the most terrifying army on earth. The exact size of Henry's army remains a subject of historical debate, but most scholars estimate it numbered between 20,000 and 40,000 men. This was a substantial force, larger than many armies that decided the fate of kingdoms. But it was hastily assembled, lacking in coordination, and crucially, it was built around military doctrines and tactics that were fundamentally mismatched against the Mongol way of war. European cavalry tactics of the period emphasized the mass charge, the moment when hundreds of armored knights would thunder forward in a wall of steel and horseflesh, smashing into enemy lines with irresistible force. It was a tactic that had proven devastatingly effective against other European armies, against Saracens in the Crusades, against any foe foolish enough to stand before the charge. But the Mongols had spent generations perfecting the art of destroying exactly this kind of force. As Henry's army approached the field near Lignitz, his scouts brought increasingly disturbing reports. The Mongol force was smaller than expected, perhaps 15,000 to 20,000 warriors. This should have been encouraging news. Henry's army likely outnumbered the enemy. But there was something in the way the Mongols moved, in their casual confidence, that unnerved even veteran warriors. The Mongols made no attempt to fortify a position or seek favorable ground. They simply waited in the open field, their forces spread out in a way that seemed almost careless to European eyes. It was a trap, though Henry couldn't have known it. Everything about the Mongol deployment was designed to invite exactly the kind of attack that European armies excelled at. It was bait, carefully crafted by generals who had destroyed armies from China to Russia using these exact tactics. On the morning of April 9th, as mist rose from the fields around Lignitz, Henry the Pious attended Mass. According to chroniclers, he received communion and prayed for hours, preparing his soul for what he knew might be his final battle. His chaplains blessed the army, sprinkling holy water on the assembled warriors and invoking the protection of God against the pagan invaders. Religious fervor ran high among the Christian forces. This was not just a battle for territory or political power. In their minds, this was a holy war, a test of faith. They were defending Christendom itself against a heathen horde that seemed to have been sent by Satan himself to test the faithful. The banners of the cross flew alongside the various heraldic standards of the Polish and German nobility. War cries mixed prayers with battle hymns. The Mongol commanders Kaidan and Baidar watched the Christian army deploy with the practiced eyes of men who had seen this exact scenario play out dozens of times before. They noted the heavy armor, the powerful war horses, the confident bearing of the European knights, who clearly expected their superior equipment to carry the day. The Mongols, by contrast, wore lighter armor, typically made of hardened leather with metal scales or plates protecting vital areas. Their horses were smaller, tougher steppe ponies that lacked the raw power of European destriers, but possessed far greater endurance and maneuverability. And most importantly, nearly every Mongol warrior carried the composite bow, that masterpiece of steppe engineering that could shoot farther and with more power than anything in the European arsenal. The battle began not with a clash of arms, but with a Mongol maneuver that had been perfected over decades. As the European knights prepared their charge, a portion of the Mongol force suddenly wheeled and began to ride away, as if in panic or retreat. To Henry's commanders, it seemed like a gift from God. The enemy was already breaking, fleeing before the might of Christian arms. The order was given, and thousands of European cavalry thundered forward in pursuit. It was exactly what the Mongols wanted. The heavily armored European knights, magnificent in their charges, were slow and cumbersome once committed to a pursuit. Their horses, carrying enormous weight, tired quickly. And as they rode after the seemingly fleeing Mongols, the European formation began to break apart. Faster knights pulled ahead. Slower ones fell behind. Units lost cohesion. Gaps appeared in the lines. Then, with brutal efficiency, the trap was sprung. The retreating Mongols suddenly turned, and from the flanks appeared thousands more Mongol cavalry that had been concealed by terrain and tactical positioning. The European knights found themselves surrounded by clouds of horse archers, who circled them like wolves around wounded prey. Arrows began to fall like deadly rain. The Mongol composite bow, shot from horseback by warriors who had trained since childhood to shoot while riding at full gallop, was devastatingly effective. The arrows couldn't easily penetrate the heavy plate armor worn by the knights, but they didn't need to. They struck horses, finding gaps in the barding that protected the animals. They targeted faces, throats, anywhere that armor didn't cover. They hit the less well-armored men-at-arms and infantry who made up the bulk of the European force. The European knights, masters of close combat, found themselves unable to close with an enemy that refused to stand and fight. Every time they charged, the Mongols simply rode away, their lighter horses easily outpacing the European destriers. And all the while, arrows continued to fall. The Mongols employed sophisticated tactics that had been refined through generations of warfare. Different units would take turns engaging, always keeping pressure on the enemy while rotating fresh troops to the front. They used smoke, possibly from pots of burning materials that created screening smoke, to confuse and disorient their opponents. Some chronicles mention that a smoke screen was used at Lignitz, though the exact nature of this smoke remains debated by historians. What is certain is that the Mongols employed every psychological tactic in their considerable arsenal to break the morale of their enemies. As the battle raged, Henry the Pious found himself in an impossible situation. His army was being torn apart by an enemy they couldn't catch and couldn't hurt. The vaunted charge of European heavy cavalry, that had been the dominant tactical doctrine for centuries, was being rendered utterly obsolete. Some of the European units began to break. Town militia, watching the armored knights being slaughtered, started to flee. Panic spread like wildfire. Henry, displaying the courage that had earned him his epithet, attempted to rally his forces. He led his personal guard in repeated charges, trying desperately to come to grips with the Mongol horse archers. But it was futile. The Mongols had spent decades perfecting the art of defeating exactly this kind of opponent. The Teutonic Knights, those hardened veterans of countless campaigns, fought with desperate courage. Unlike some of the hastily raised levies, these were professional warriors who understood that flight meant death. They maintained formation and discipline, even as the battle turned into a massacre around them. Some chronicles suggest that the Teutonic contingent managed to inflict significant casualties on the Mongols in close combat, showing that when European heavy cavalry could close with their enemies, they were indeed formidable. But these moments of success were isolated islands in a sea of disaster. For every Mongol warrior struck down in close combat, the horse archers killed 10 Europeans from a distance. As the day wore on, it became clear that the battle was lost. Henry's army was being systematically destroyed. Worse still, news arrived that King Wenceslaus and the Bohemian reinforcements were less than a day's march away. If Henry could have held out, if he could have simply waited, he would have had the numbers to potentially defeat the Mongol force. But it was too late. The battle had been joined, and it was turning into a catastrophe. Henry made the decision to attempt a fighting withdrawal, to salvage what he could of his army and retreat to regroup with the Bohemian forces. But the Mongols, sensing victory, pressed their advantage with ruthless efficiency. Henry the Pious, surrounded by his personal guard, was cut off from the main body of his army. The Mongols recognized him, either by his heraldry or by the quality of his armor and the way his men rallied around him. Mongol warriors prized high-value prisoners for ransom, but in the chaos of battle, Henry was struck down and killed. The exact circumstances of his death remain unclear, lost in the fog of medieval chronicling where fact mixed with legend. What is certain is that Duke Henry II of Silesia, Henry the Pious, died on the field at Lignitz, fighting to defend his lands and his faith against an enemy that seemed invincible. The death of their commander broke whatever cohesion remained in the European army. What had been a retreat became a rout. Soldiers threw down their weapons and fled in terror. The Mongols pursued with characteristic efficiency, cutting down fleeing men with the practiced ease of hunters. The massacre continued for miles. Some sources suggest that over 20,000 European soldiers died at Lignitz, though medieval casualty figures are notoriously unreliable. What cannot be disputed is that it was a disaster of epic proportions for European arms. The cream of Polish and Silesian nobility lay dead on the field. Several major commanders of the military orders were killed. Entire towns lost most of their fighting-age men. After the battle, the Mongols engaged in a practice that had become their signature across the conquered territories. They collected the right ears from the slain enemies, filling 9 large sacks with their grisly trophies. This wasn't mere savagery, it was a calculated measure to determine accurate casualty counts and demonstrate the scale of their victory. Some chronicles, possibly embellished by medieval storytellers, claim that the Mongols filled an entire cart with the heads of the slain to display before the walls of nearby cities. Whether this specific detail is true or apocryphal, it reflects the terror that the Mongol victories inspired. Henry's body was recovered after the battle. According to legend, his wife identified him only by recognizing that he had 6 toes on 1 foot, his body having been so mutilated in the fighting that his face was unrecognizable. He was buried with full honors at a monastery in Wroclaw, where he was later venerated as a martyr and defender of Christendom. His death, rather than being the end of his story, became the beginning of his legend. Henry the Pious became a symbol of Christian resistance against the pagan invaders, a duke who had sacrificed everything in defense of his faith and his people. But here is where the story takes an unexpected turn. Despite their overwhelming victory at Lignitz, despite having shattered one of the largest armies Europe could field, the Mongols did not press their advantage into the heart of Western Europe. The day after the battle, they learned that King Wenceslaus and his Bohemian army had arrived in the region. Rather than seek another battle, the Mongol force withdrew and rode south to rejoin the main Mongol army in Hungary. This decision has puzzled historians for centuries. Why would an army that had just demonstrated its overwhelming superiority suddenly retreat? The answer lies in understanding Mongol strategic thinking, which operated on a level of sophistication that few medieval European commanders could match. The Northern Column's objective had never been the conquest of Poland. It was a diversionary attack, designed to prevent Polish and Bohemian forces from reinforcing Hungary, which was the Mongols' true target. By engaging and destroying Henry's army, by forcing Wenceslaus to deploy his forces in Poland rather than marching south, the Mongol Northern Column had accomplished its mission perfectly. Batu Khan and Subutai were meanwhile conducting one of the most brilliant campaigns in military history in Hungary, utterly destroying King Bela's forces at the Battle of Mohi, just 2 days after Lignitz. The twin victories of Lignitz and Mohi represented the high-water mark of the Mongol invasion of Europe. In the space of 2 days in April 1241, the Mongols had shattered two of the largest armies Europe could field, demonstrating a level of military superiority that was truly terrifying. The road to Vienna, to Italy, to the heart of Christendom itself lay open. Europe held its collective breath, waiting for the final blow to fall. Papal legates preached that the end times had come. Prayers were said in churches across the continent. Preparations were made for desperate last stands. And then, incredibly, the blow never came. In December of 1241, news reached the Mongol forces in Hungary that the great Khan Ogedei had died in Mongolia. According to Mongol law and tradition, all the princes of the blood needed to return to Karakorum, the Mongol capital, for the election of a new Khan. Batu Khan, who had his own ambitions for the succession, could not afford to remain in Europe while the future leadership of the empire was decided. In early 1242, the Mongol armies withdrew from Hungary and began their long journey back to the steppes. They would never return in force. The Mongol invasion of Europe, which had seemed unstoppable, was over almost as suddenly as it had begun. The Battle of Liegnitz, despite being a crushing defeat for European arms, had inadvertently bought time. The Mongol Northern Column's engagement in Poland had delayed them just enough that they were still consolidating. In Hungary, when news of Ogedei's death arrived, some historians have speculated that if Henry had not marched out to meet the Mongols, if he had waited for Wenceslaus and allowed the Mongol column to ravage Poland unopposed, the northern force might have been able to penetrate deeper into Europe before the news from Mongolia arrived. In this interpretation, Henry's sacrifice, while militarily disastrous, may have been strategically significant in the larger picture. But this raises profound questions about the nature of historical causation and the role of individuals in shaping events. Was Europe saved by the death of a Mongol Khan thousands of miles away, or by the courage of men like Henry, who stood and fought when flight might have been wiser? The truth, as is often the case in history, is probably that both factors mattered. The Mongol withdrawal was directly caused by Ogedei's death, but the timing of that withdrawal was influenced by countless decisions made on the battlefields of Poland and Hungary. The battle had profound and lasting impacts on European military thinking. The devastating effectiveness of the Mongol composite bow demonstrated the vulnerability of heavy cavalry to missile weapons. This would contribute to a gradual shift in European tactics over the following centuries, with increased emphasis on combined arms tactics that incorporated archers and crossbowmen more effectively. The longbow, which would become famous in English hands at battles like Crécy and Agincourt, was not yet in widespread use in 1241, but the lessons of Liegnitz helped prepare the ground for its eventual adoption. The battle also revealed the limitations of feudal military organization. Henry's army, despite its impressive size, lacked the cohesion and unified command structure that made Mongol forces so effective. Different contingents followed their own commanders, coordinating poorly with other units. The Mongols, by contrast, operated with a level of tactical sophistication and unity of command that wouldn't be seen in European armies for centuries. They used sophisticated signaling systems, including flags and drums, to coordinate movements across large areas. Their forces could split and reform with a fluidity that was impossible for medieval European armies. In the decades following the battle, the memory of Lignitz became deeply embedded in Polish and European consciousness. Henry the Pious was venerated as a martyr. Churches were built in his honor. His death became the subject of chronicles, poems, and later, national legends. The site of the battle became a place of pilgrimage. In Polish national memory, Lignitz became a symbol of resistance against Eastern invasion, of sacrifice in defense of Christian Europe. This memory would be invoked again and again through Polish history, during later conflicts with Mongol successor states, during wars with the Ottoman Empire, and even in modern times. The Mongols themselves never forgot the lesson of their European campaign. Chronicles from the Mongol perspective, preserved in Persian and Chinese sources, record the battles of 1241 as significant victories that demonstrated Mongol military superiority, but they also noted the stubborn resistance of European forces, particularly the heavy cavalry and the military orders. Unlike many armies that broke and fled at the first sight of Mongol forces, the Europeans had stood and fought, inflicting casualties even in defeat. This earned them a measure of respect in Mongol military assessments. For Poland specifically, the battle was catastrophic in the short term. The death of Henry the Pious left Silesia without strong leadership at a critical moment. The death of so many nobles and knights created a power vacuum that would take years to fill. The economic damage from the Mongol raids was severe, with countless villages burned and populations slaughtered or scattered. But in a strange way, the disaster also contributed to Polish resilience. The memory of Liegnitz became a unifying force, a shared trauma that helped forge a sense of Polish identity and determination to resist foreign invasion. The battle also had significant implications for the relationship between Poland and the Teutonic Knights. The Teutonic Order's participation in the defense of Silesia enhanced their prestige and influence in the region. This would have long-term consequences for the balance of power in Eastern Europe, as the Teutonic Knights gradually expanded their own territorial holdings, eventually coming into conflict with Poland itself in later centuries. The alliance of convenience forged in the face of the Mongol threat contained the seeds of future conflicts. From a broader historical perspective, the Mongol invasion of 1241 represented a near miss for Western European civilization. If the Mongols had continued their advance, if they had not been recalled by Ogedei's death, the impact on European history would have been incalculable. Would the developing urban civilization of medieval Europe have survived? Would the Renaissance have occurred? Would the age of exploration have been launched? These are counterfactuals, impossible to answer, but they highlight just how pivotal this moment was. The Mongol Empire, at its height, possessed the military capability to conquer Europe. Only a quirk of dynastic politics prevented them from doing so. The legacy of Lignitz extends even into modern military thinking. Military historians and strategists have studied the battle extensively as an example of the decisive importance of mobility and firepower over armor and shock tactics. The Mongol tactics of feigned retreat, encirclement, and the use of missile weapons to defeat heavily armored opponents have parallels in modern warfare. The principle that mobility and range can defeat superior armor is one that has been proven repeatedly, from the battlefields of medieval Poland to the tank battles of the 20th century. In Poland today, the Battle of Liegnitz remains an important part of national historical consciousness. Memorials mark the site of the battle. Annual commemorations honor those who fell defending Europe against the Mongol invasion. The figure of Henry the Pious stands as a symbol of sacrifice and courage in the face of overwhelming odds. The battle has been the subject of countless books, scholarly articles, and popular histories. It appears in school curricula as a defining moment in Polish history. But perhaps the most profound legacy of Lignitz is what it teaches us about the nature of historical contingency. The battle demonstrates how individual decisions made in moments of crisis can have consequences that ripple through centuries. Henry's choice to march out and meet the Mongols rather than waiting for reinforcements led directly to the disaster that befell his army. Yet that same decision may have influenced the timing of the Mongol withdrawal from Europe. We cannot know for certain what would have happened if different choices had been made, but we can recognize that the choices of individuals matter, even in the face of seemingly overwhelming historical forces. The battle also reminds us of the importance of understanding military innovation and adaptation. The Mongols succeeded not through superior numbers or resources, but through superior tactics, organization, and adaptation to circumstances. They had learned from decades of warfare across diverse terrain against diverse enemies. They incorporated lessons from each campaign, constantly refining their methods. European armies, operating within more rigid doctrinal and organizational frameworks, proved slower to adapt. This disparity in adaptability and learning was as important as any difference in weapons or numbers. In the final analysis, the Battle of Liegnitz stands as one of the most significant military encounters of the medieval period, even though it ended in decisive defeat for European forces. It was a battle where worlds collided. The military system that had dominated Western Europe for centuries, based on heavy cavalry and feudal organization, met the sophisticated steppe warfare tradition that had conquered most of Asia. The result was a stark demonstration of the superiority of the Mongol system in open field battle. But it was also a demonstration of European courage and determination, of men who fought and died rather than submit to an invader they viewed as a threat to everything they held sacred. The story of Lignitz is ultimately a story about the human capacity for both terrible violence and remarkable courage. It's about leaders like Henry the Pious who made difficult choices knowing they might cost everything. It's about ordinary soldiers, knights and peasants alike, who stood in the face of the most terrifying military force of their age. And it's about how a single day on a field in Silesia became part of the larger tapestry of European history, influencing events and decisions for centuries to come. The Mongols may have won the battle, but they did not win the war for Europe. The sacrifice at Liegnitz, combined with the accident of Ogedei's death, ensured that Western European civilization survived to continue its development, setting the stage for the transformations that would eventually reshape the world.